I just started as a sort of new student at a private boarding school. There is something wrong with students here. Have you ever woken up inside a school you don't remember going to? Jet lag must have seriously had my ass. I'm not sure where my mind had been wandering at that moment, though it must have been far across the galaxy because I found myself standing at a breakfast bar, which could be likened to brunch from how elegant everything was. It was in jet lag. I knew the effects of jet lag, and I was pretty sure memory loss wasn't a symptom. Partial memory loss, because I could remember everything about myself and my life, except how exactly I had come to be in the school. Several thoughts twitched in my head as I dragged my luggage, a bright pink suitcase, toward a table strewn with rich people food. Looking around and drinking in my surroundings, I appeared to be in a school cafeteria. Private school, judging from everyone, and my own uniform. A white shirt and plaid skirt with a blazer thrown over the top. It felt weirdly comfortable, already bizarrely my size, like I had worn it before. I wasn't sure why, but standing in that room gave me déjà vu. I felt like I knew the mini water fountain stood proudly in the center, and the coffee machine station near the entrance. I knew the exact combination of numbers to get an espresso and trick the machine into giving me another for free. I knew that bacon and maple sandwiches were popular, and you had to fight for double chocolate chip brownies, which were always gone first. Except, I didn't know this place. This school was alien to me, and yet my memory was telling me otherwise. It was the first day of jitters, I thought. Surely, temporary memory loss existed, right? My aunt had hit her head during a confrontation with a mall employee a few years ago. She forgot her name for a while, after falling head first into the fountain, not before cracking her head on cold marble. Though this was different. How was it possible that I had completely forgotten not just my journey to the school, but choosing it, as well as saying goodbye to my parents? So much was missing, and the more I was thinking about it, the progressively more panicked I was starting to become. The room itself was huge, filled with small picnic-like tables to eat on, and a lounging area with beanbags and what looked like the latest game consoles. Wide windows looked out onto the school grounds where cherry blossom trees stood. Groups of kids sitting in groups and spread out on their blazers and picnic baskets under a late afternoon sun. There were no lunch ladies or bland school food. I was looking at chocolate-filled pastries, donuts, mini sandwiches, and nibbles, baskets full of every soda I could think of, and a whole selection at the end of the table with flavored fizzy and scented bottled water. It felt like dreaming. But when I reached forward and grabbed a toasted bagel and smeared it with cream cheese, cramming it into my mouth, the food tasted real. I downed half of a mimosa from a tray of them sitting on a golden platter, and the drinks tasted real too. The only thing which patented this place to a fantasy were the students themselves. There was a group of them sitting closest to me, 4 guys and 2 girls. They looked normal at first glance. I caught pieces of their conversation, something about a TV show they had all been watching. I had been watching one girl delicately put her sandwiches into a makeshift Jenga tower, when the guy next to her suddenly slammed his head into the table without warning. The impact made me cringe, the cream cheese bagel beginning to creep its way back up my throat. It was odd, the way he did it. It was during a conversation where he seemed reasonably okay before lifting his head and slamming his face into his own plate of food. After several more times, I was starting to see bruising around his right eye, his lips split, blood smearing his temples. This guy had done serious damage to his face, and yet, he didn't even seem to notice it himself. He didn't notice the way his head twitched almost inhumanely to the side, his arms seemingly having a mind of their own. But he continued to smile and talk with the others, who didn't react to him almost splitting his head open. The girl started laughing about something, and he joined in, unfazed by pooling red spurting from his nose and lips. He showed no signs of pain despite his body trembling under the table and his shaky hands when he took a bite of his own sandwich. None of them commented on their spilled drinks or ruined lunches, or the amount of blood splattered on the table. I had half a mind to announce I would get the school nurse, but I had no idea where the nurse's office was. The rest of the cafeteria didn't even look his way, and the guy had definitely made noise. Half of his lunch was on the ground, and when I looked closer, there was an ugly crack in the hardwood table. Still, though, no reaction from his friends, who continued talking like their friend hadn't just given himself a mild concussion out of nowhere, quite literally speaking, through blood staining his teeth and filling his mouth. I had found myself completely transfixed by this guy's pain endurance, as he paid no attention to the state of his face, when another guy strode over to the brunch table, filling his plate with pastries and purple macarons. "So, you're the new girl, huh?" The guy stood with his back to me, his attention on the food. I didn't blame him. It was practically a banquet. Wearing the same uniform, an untucked shirt over black pants, a loose tie, his blazer awkwardly hanging off his shoulder, he delved into the feast. I could tell from the fancy-looking watch on his wrist, his parents had the kind of money he could throw away on several hundred, though I couldn't speak from an outsider's perspective. My mother was the head of the board of education of our town, and my father had a high-paid job in the government. Not that I knew what it was. What I know is that it could give me a sheltered life, so it's not like I was surprised I'd ended up in this school. But it was the why and the how which was confusing me. The boy's accent was refreshing in a room full of Americans, a cocktail of British and Aussie. I could barely see his face, just a simple facial structure, as well as dark hair sprouting from a hat nestled over his head, though I could just about make out Asian American features. When he turned to an awkward angle, he became more of a silhouette rather than a human being, late afternoon sunlight completely drowning his identity. "Yep," I said, keeping my eye on the boy who had surely given himself a concussion. I was expecting him to collapse from blood loss, or maybe suddenly start screaming, becoming aware of the state of himself. It could have been a delayed reaction which could explain his lack of attention. However, it didn't explain the others who happily chatted with him, completely ignoring how much blood he was losing. I turned away from the food, intrigued, and slightly horrified by the guy who now appeared to be playfully flirting with the girl next to him. She had attracted my attention from the almost plastic look of her, if that was even a word. Everything about her was shiny and superficial. Her uniform was way too small for her, clinging to the perfect figure. Though it hugged just a little too perfectly, it looked like a squeeze to get on. Her hair was unbrushed, hanging in clumpy golden rat tails in front of her face. Makeup scrolled over her face like a preschooler had used her face as their own personal canvas. A doll. The girl reminded me of one of my own abandoned dolls back at my mom's house. I stopped playing with dolls when I started middle school, but Mom refused to throw them away. I found a box of them last summer, amused by the way I treated them as a little kid. I had ripped and torn at their hair, drowned them in the kitchen sink, given them hair transplants with my mom's scissors. That is what the girl reminded me of. One of my abandoned dolls. Her appearance wasn't bothering anyone to my surprise. This was a private boarding school for kids with parents with serious cash, and nobody, and I mean nobody, was commenting on the girl who looked like she hadn't showered in half a decade. The guy's nose had stopped bleeding. Thank God. But I found it hard to believe the girl seemingly did not care. The two of them pretended to kiss, laughing with the others. When they embraced jokingly, he smeared blood all over her cheeks and lips, which she didn't comment on. The girl didn't cringe or cry out. Her eyes were bright, lips pulled into a grin which was definitely flirting back. Was this school crazy? Or was I? "Hello? I'm talking to you." The guy still wasn't facing me, picking his way through the food, sidestepping towards the chocolate fountain. "What is this place?" I found myself asking him. "Eden Academy," he said. "You know, the school the elites and the bratty misbehaving kids. Also a dumping ground for kids they don't want anymore." He sighed, sniffing a mocktail and pulling a face, especially if they're divorced and can't even stand to look at each other. Mom disappears to some exotic location, claiming it's PR, while Daddy ships you to boarding school. Well, that sounded personal. But why don't I remember coming here? The guy stuffed a cupcake in his mouth. I don't know, he said, spraying crumbs. You could be jet-lagged. Or maybe you hit your head. He finally turned to face me, and suddenly, I found myself unable to breathe. It wasn't his appearance, dark brown hair pinned by a pair of Ray-Bans, amused eyes drinking me in. No, it was something else. Something I couldn't put a finger on or even reach out for. This guy had set all of my nerve endings on fire, and I didn't know why or how. I knew what a crush was, the type of butterflies in your gut crush which twisted you from the inside out. This wasn't a crush though. This wasn't a romantic attraction or a stupid crush. Instead of making my heart flutter, this guy's face was setting my body into fight or flight. It was just like the coffee machine and the strange sense of deja vu I had felt inside the cafeteria. I knew this guy. I recognized the tinge in his accent. I knew that he hated purple macarons, but ate them because he liked to taste the artificial flavoring. That he hated horror movies, was a clumsy drunk, and despised his family for abandoning him. But I didn't want to know him. Something inside me wanted to get as far away from him as possible. It didn't make sense that I knew about him. I knew his face and accent, but I also didn't know him. The guy must have seen my expression, his brows furrowing. Are you a guy? Yes, I lied. Uh-huh. Abandoning his plate, he leaned against the table with his arms folded. So, what do you go by? Uh-huh. He rolled his eyes. Duh, your name. My attention flicked to another guy standing at the food table. This kid was more put together than the guy in front of me. Instead of the blazer, he wore a white shirt and pants combo, without a tie. His hair was tied back in a ponytail people like him could only pull off. Private schools birthed rich, attractive-looking students. This guy was no exception. At first, I thought he wasn't sure what to get before he lunged forward like an animal, stuffing food into his mouth. I watched him cram 4 cupcakes and 6 sandwiches, followed by chocolate-coated strawberries and fruit pastries. He was making a mess, knocking the chocolate fountain over with trembling hands, before carving his fingernails into a whipped cream cake, sitting on perfect silver. When he dropped to his knees and pillaged through a mountain of mini cupcakes, I started to feel nauseous. He wasn't stopping. I watched him tear chicken directly from the bone and pour the whole bowl of potato salad into his mouth before moving on to every other food in his vicinity. It was almost animal-like. His eyes were blank as he sat on his knees, gnawing on crushed cupcakes and frozen yogurt. His lips were smeared with food, chin dripping with icing and potato salad, and chocolate and strawberry frosting. I looked around for someone to help him, for someone to tell him to stop. But just like the guy who had slammed his head into the table multiple times, nobody seemed to notice. Even the Aussie kid still leaning against the table didn't even glance at the boy who was starting to turn a shade of green I didn't know existed. I could see his body's reaction to the food, that it was trying to stop him, his stomach revolting. And he continued, his lips set into a pained grin. This wasn't normal. It was inhuman. This kid was going to burst, I thought dizzily. Becca. I managed to answer the Aussie's question. Something hit my face, sliding down my cheek. A wet piece of onion from the potato salad, flying in every direction. What's wrong with him? The Aussie frowned, his gaze flicking to the boy who was now sticking 2 fingers down his throat, forcing all the food back up, which came out in an undigested sludge. His smile didn't disappear as he continued, grasping fistfuls of food and stuffing it into his gaping mouth. Huh? The kid blinked, seemingly looking straight past the mess on the ground and the feral-like state the ponytailed kid was in, looking directly at me. His eyes seemed bright and alive, but looking closer, it was almost like there was a barrier in place stopping him from seeing what was going on. It was either that, or I was going fucking crazy and was hallucinating some pretty fucked up shit. "Oh, that's bulimia," he shrugged, smirking. "Why? Do you like the look of him?" His words didn't make sense in my head, and the name sounded like some kind of sick joke. In a school full of private school kids, I could understand name-calling. This, however, was a whole other level. Just like the boy who slammed his head into the table, and the girl who seemingly didn't know hygiene, nobody was noticing or commenting on them. I could see the blood vessels in the ponytailed kid's eyes starting to bulge and burst, rivulets of dark red seeping down his chin, joining the sludge of food. He let out what sounded like a choked sob before reaching for another cupcake and forcing it into his mouth, already bulging a variety of sweet and savory. I had seen hunger before. I had seen binge eating and even bulimia when I was a kid. But this wasn't it. This was way past an eating disorder. From the jerking way his hand was moving, twitching towards his mouth like a doll, it almost looked like his hands had a whole mind of their own. I felt sick to my stomach watching him, knowing from the look in his eyes he was in pain, and he wanted to stop, but he couldn't. "What? What did you just call him?" The Aussie almost slipped in the mess on the floor, though managed to keep his balance. "Oh, bulimia. Well, that's his name." He stuck out his hand with a grin. "I'm hot stuff." His name took me off guard, and I almost laughed. I was being pranked, surely. This was a little too fucking far for a stupid prank. I had to force myself to look away from the boy, who had stopped eating once more, violently throwing up bloody mush behind me. "You're what?" I shook my head, struggling not to cry. "I'm sorry, but are you not going to help that kid?" Hot Stuff inclined his head like I was the crazy one, like I was the one slowly eating myself to death. "Why?" He chuckled. "It seems all right to me." He turned to the boy, amused eyes sparkling. "Yo, bulimia. You girl wants to know if you're good." To my confusion, the kid eating himself to death nodded with a laugh. "Yeah, dude, I'm good." He paused, lifting his head, and I had to avert my gaze before I threw up myself. I wasn't seeing food anymore. Instead, there was just blood pouring from his mouth. His body had rejected all of that food, and from the pallid look of his skin, he needed serious help. Even he, though, seemed unfazed by what he had done, instead shooting me a grin through pooling red. The boy got up and stumbled out of the cafeteria. Even from a distance, I could still hear him violently tearing through another cupcake he'd stuffed into his pocket. Hot Stuff watched him go with a blank look on his face and turned back to the ruined spread of food with a smile which seemed permanently glued to his face. "So, Becca," he spun on his heel, taking a bite of an apple. "Where are you from?" "Cleveland," I said in a daze. I had so many questions, and most of them were threatening to come out in a shriek I wasn't sure I could control. "Was that guy okay? Did he go to the nurse?" I had to swallow bouts of hysteria clawing for a way out. "Bulimia?" Hot Stuff shrugged through a mouthful of apple. "It looked okay to me. Though I get it." He grinned. "Bulimia is a good-looking guy. I can see why you're interested, Becca." He inclined his head, his gaze finding the stain of red on teal-green tiles. His eyes darkened for a moment, expression twisting. I thought he was going to snap out of this trance everyone was forced in, forced to look through rose-tinted glasses and blind to the reality around them. Instead, though, he shook his head and tipped his head back with a sigh. "But I think our boy is taken. I'm not sure by who. But yeah, he's probably spoken for. No, I said in a frustrated hiss. The guy he was making himself sick, and he didn't even seem to care. I gestured around the room. None of you seem to care. Even you. Don't you think that's weird? I took a step towards him, and deja vu sprung again. I had done this before. I had shouted at him before, and he had pulled that exact same expression. Amused with a smidge of pissed. I even somehow knew his reaction would be rolling his eyes and tipping his back with a groan, shaking away intense feelings coming over me like ice-cold water. I let out a breath. Did you even see him spewing his stomach lining? The guy was bleeding. And all of you just pretend it's not happening? How is that not seriously f***ed up? Now that I had his attention, I couldn't stop myself. Where are the teachers? I hissed out. I don't even f***ing remember coming here. There are 0 teachers, and you're all acting like watching someone barf their inside out. It's normal. Hot Stuff looked confused. Again, like I was the crazy one. He opened his mouth to speak, before a voice rang out across the room, startling me. Attention! The buzz of white noise and chatting around the cafeteria came to a sudden halt when the girl I had been watching earlier, who still had her boyfriend's blood all over her face, jumped onto a table, waving her arms to shut everyone up. And they did, as if she had some kind of hypnotic control over them. Every face turned towards the girl. Now that I was seeing her up close, this girl looked even worse. Her skin didn't look like skin. It glistened artificial light, almost like I was looking at a real-life doll. Smiling widely like everyone else, with that same oddly blank look in her eyes, the girl started to talk about things I didn't care about, because I was getting out. There was no way I was staying in a school where the entire student body just existed to be grinning, mindless robots who acted like NPCs. However, even when I was backing away slowly, ready to find the nearest exits, I couldn't help feeling a sense of dread coiling in my gut, stopping me from leaving. Slowly, I turned back to the girl who was talking about the cheerleading team needing more members. And there was a missing laptop reported by an underclassman. Hot Stuff was like everyone else, casually leaning against the brunch table and smiling at the doll-like girl. It was when her plastic-looking fingers went to her hair and began to tear it out, did my stomach start to twist itself into knots. She didn't just touch her hair, running her fingers through strands of fake-looking locks. Instead, the girl started to tug at her scalp, ripping out chunks of hair with a wide smile. It was when smeared red started to appear, first on her forehead, and then her neck and cheek, as she fisted handfuls of hair and tore it straight from her scalp, when I realized I was staring at an actual doll with human-like features. It wasn't just her arms and legs. Her face looked plastic. The hair, stained deep, dark red, stuck between her fingers, was fake. Not like hair extensions, like actual doll hair I had memories of tugging my Barbie brush through as a little kid. Something ice cold crept down my spine. I was paralyzed to the spot, watching her claw at her head until half of her hair was gone. What looked like shredded skin, something fleshy and pink, caked under perfectly manicured nails. Is everyone excited to speak to Abigail tonight? She shouted out into her audience of transfixed faces. You couldn't see it, I thought. Glancing at Hot Stuff, his expression wasn't even twitching as this girl ripped at not just hair, but her scalp, the tips of her fingers dripping scarlet. His head was cocked at an angle, lips forming a smile of appreciation. Not even the girl noticed what she was doing, continuing her speech about a pep rally they were all excited for. I found my voice somewhere between stumbling into the brunch table and falling to my knees, before diving back to my feet every instinct telling me to turn and run away from what I had found myself stuck inside. I was still curious, however. Part of me wanted to know why splinters in me knew the school, why I knew hot stuff, and why I was transfixed by this girl ripping herself apart in front of a silent mass of hypnotized kids, staring at her like she was the second coming of Christ. Who is Abigail? I barely heard myself. I almost felt like I was speaking into a void, my voice more of a breathy murmur. Hot Stuff's head whipped around suddenly, his lips twitching into a scowl. It was the way he moved, his expression darkening, which sent my heart into my throat. His voice was too loud, and the room had gone deathly silent. Hot Stuff's lips curled into a snarl. I could sense him stiffening up, his hands falling into fists, almost territorial.
You don't know who Abigail is?
No, I said in a breath, eyeing the exit, because this guy had gone from dazedly smiling and trance-like to feral animal in a matter of a second. I just got here. His lips contorted into disgust, and before I could back away, he was grabbing my arm and throwing it up.
Biker wants to meet Abigail.
Hot Stuff jumped up and down like an excited kid. It took me a moment to realize it, a sudden, unexplainable agony curling my lips into a silent screech. But then I was staring down at the boy's fingers wrapped around my forearm, and my flesh bubbling underneath it. My skin turned an unnatural shade of red. With words I couldn't coerce choking on my tongue, I wrenched my arm away from him. The flesh of my arm was burned. Not just burned, it was charred, already melted through my blazer and shirt. The pain was nothing like I'd ever felt before. Vicious bolts of electricity stinging my skin. I grabbed a bottle of water to douse my arm before another hand caught it. I lifted my head to find a doll-like girl standing directly in front of me. Her smile was too wide, her teeth far too white to be natural.
Do you really want to meet Abigail?
She spoke in a shriek, and the room of kids seemed to mimic her. I couldn't speak, my attention on my arm. And then Hot Stuff. You couldn't have been that hot, right? Not hot enough to burn straight through my skin.
Hey!
The girl poked me in the forehead, and her finger felt like straight-up plastic. I fought against cringing away with every eye on me, including Hot Stuff, whose lip was curled.
What's your name?
She frowned.
I don't think I've seen you before.
Becca, I whispered, writhing in pain.
Hi, Becca.
The girl waved cheerily.
I'm Barbie.
She leaned close to me, her breath tickling my ear.
I can't wait for you to meet Abigail tonight.
I got out there fast. Hot Stuff's blank grin was driving me crazy. Every time I caught his eye, I wanted to know how exactly he had managed to do that to my arm, though his unseeing eyes and lack of brain cells turned me off. Luckily, I did find a nurse's office with an actual adult who managed to clean me up and bandage my arm. When I was sitting on an observation bed, swinging my legs, the woman was applying ointment. She tutted to herself. You would not believe how many kids I have coming in here after spilling scalding coffee all over themselves. She chuckled. Please take care when handling hot beverages. It wasn't coffee, I whispered. It was one of the guys. The nurse straightened up, her lips twisting into a frown. She was pressing far too much pressure on my arm. I tugged away with a hiss. She apologized with a gentle smile. I'm sorry. Are you saying another student has thrown coffee all over you? No, I hissed out. His hand. I leaned forward. That's what I'm trying to tell you. He grabbed my arm, and I think he burned my arm. Shaking my head, I hissed out of breath. "There's something wrong with them, these kids. They're crazy." She hummed. "Do you think he intended to hurt you?" The nurse wasn't getting it, and I couldn't be bothered trying to explain what I was sure had been a 17-year-old kid almost burning my flesh from the bone. When the nurse first saw it, she called an ambulance and told me I would be taken to an emergency room, which never happened. I don't know if she forgot, or maybe she had some kind of memory loss, because she sent me to my room with a bag of candy and a bottle of water. I thought I'd have trouble finding my room, though I found it easily, navigating the ancient and yet modern aesthetic of the school. The stairs to the girls' dorm were practically crumbling, but modern architecture made up the dorms themselves, with wide windows and doors with mechanical locks on them. When I dragged my luggage through a fancy wooden door with an ornate handle, my stuff was already set up, my clothes in the wardrobe, all of my books and my comics stuffed into a shelf by the window. Even my laptop had been set up on my desk. I made a mental note to thank my roommate, a curly blonde who was standing in the middle of the room, staring at me like I had grown a second head. When I made a move towards her, she stumbled back, eyes widening with fright. Her side of the room was strangely empty except for a blanket, some books, and one stuffed teddy bear sitting awkwardly on her pillows. It almost looked like she was the new girl. Ignoring her look of horror as I strode over to my bed and flung my luggage down, I plonked myself down on my comforter. I shot her a smile. "Thanks for unpacking for me, but I'm not staying here." The girl frowned at me before hurrying over to her desk, grabbing a pen and a notepad, and scribbling something down, before holding it up. "I'm sorry, Becca. I'm sorry, Becca." She wrote something else in a frenzied squiggle. "I can't help you." Something in my chest tightened. "How do you know my name?" I whispered. "Did someone tell you?" When she lifted her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, I couldn't stop myself from asking the question nobody seemed to want to answer. "What the f*** is going on?" I hissed out. "This school is psychotic. Why am I here? Why can't I remember coming here?" The girl looked torn for a moment before shaking her head. Instead of using the pen and pad, she took slow, stumbling strides toward me before opening her mouth. I thought she was showing me her perfect teeth at first, teeth which were unnaturally white just like Barbie's. When I looked closer, though, I realized what she was pointing at with the tip of her index finger. My roommate didn't have a tongue, or she did, but it was barely that of one. Just a slither of something which had managed to hang on. Her tongue had been severed from the trauma in the back of her mouth, yanked out. I think that was the point I thought, no, I wasn't staying there. I didn't even wait for my roommate to close her mouth. I'm not sure how I got from A to B so fast. I think it was the adrenaline. I passed kids who smiled widely at me, and I wondered if their tongues were gone too. Once I was outside, however, my shoes treading on tarmac under my feet, in a dizzying and confusing flash of light, I was back in my room in front of my roommate. Now that I was looking at her, really taking her in, freckled cheeks and an oddly shaped nose, hair she was constantly tucking behind her ears because it always got in her face. I knew her too. She held up her notepad and told me to stop, told me there was no point. I didn't care. I tried again, and again, and again. Every single time, I barely managed to step over the threshold before I was back inside my room, screaming and clawing at my own hair in frustration. On my third or fourth attempt, I did manage to see a gate, an open gate. So there was a way out. Except every time my shoes touched the outside, cool air grazing my face, I was exactly where I started, sitting on my bed with a slowly building migraine. My roommate, who seemed the sanest out of everyone, handed me a bottle of water, which I downed half of before throwing the bottle against the wall.
What is going on?
I whispered in a shriek.
Why can't I get out of here?
The girl scribbled something else. Don't go to sleep tonight. She shook her head. If you go to sleep, you will join them. She drew a sad face, which made me feel maybe a fraction better. I grabbed a cushion off of my bed, squeezing it to my chest. What's your name? The girl frowned. She wrote down, Did you forget? Her expression seemed to change for a moment, her eyes turning hollow, which aged her way above 17. Tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, she scribbled over that, writing, My name is Josie. Josie? I said, Why can't I fall asleep tonight? My roommate's gaze found the ground before she hesitantly picked up her pad and pen. I already got my punishment, she had written, gesturing to her mouth. I spread a lot of false rumors and... She hesitated, the pen on the paper. It's not like I agree with my punishment, but I am glad I no longer have use of my mouth. The twisted and contorted legs of a spider wriggled their way down my spine. What? I'm better now, Josie wrote down with a smiley face. We're all better now. I thought she was finished before Josie scrawled down something else, holding the notepad up, a smile curving on her lips. I recognized that exact gleam in her eyes. It had sparkled in Hot Stuff and Barbies. Josie's eyes weren't quite blank, but I couldn't call them coherent. I can't wait for you to meet Abigail, she wrote, her handwriting progressively harder to read, like she had ignored her own warning. Josie spent hours writing to me about Abigail, though halfway through the hour mark, my roommate's writing became nothing but a confusing smear of black creeping across the page. I saw the same feral look twisted in her eyes, identical to the boy who had almost eaten himself to death, and Hot Stuff when I admitted I didn't know who Abigail was. This was blindly worshipping someone I didn't even know. Josie didn't stop until the pen had run out, and she was using her fingernails instead. When I grasped at her hand and told her to stop, she shoved me back with strength I didn't know she had. Suffice to say, I did sleep that night. There was nothing else to do but freak out and attempt to break out the window, which, surprise, surprise, had bars on them. I wasn't sure when I fell asleep, but I had woken up with a familiar scalding hot and clammy hand slamming over my mouth, gagging my screams. Hot Stuff. Next to him, to my surprise, was the boy with the ponytail, and Barbie. This time, his touch was blistering. When I screamed, he removed his hand and ordered me to get out of bed. I did, falling face first onto Josie's beaded rug. I was dragged to my feet, the three of them dragging me from my room. Before I could speak, a blindfold was wrapped around my eyes, and I had to bite back a shriek. Hot Stuff's fingers cinched the back of my neck, his breath like steam, making me shiver. Stumbling in the dark, I fell twice, only to be tugged to my feet violently. Something about the way I was being pulled, my bare toes trailing across carpet, then wood, and finally, freezing cold stone, sent waves of deja vu taking my mind once again. I knew this route. I knew the uncomfortable feeling of marble tiles on the soles of my feet. I knew my own stifled giggles as we attempted to hide from teachers on the prowl looking for kids sneaking out after curfew. Blinking through the blindfold, I knew the hypnotic glow of candles at the corner of my eye as we took slow steps in our descent. But all of these times locked in my memory, unreachable pieces of myself which had been torn away. I had been on the other side. I wasn't the person being dragged roughly, their trembling hands bound behind their back with tough rope. I was the one dragging them. I had dragged multiple kids down these exact stone steps, laughing when they cried out for their mommy. When I was shoved onto my knees, the blindfold was finally tugged off. Candlelight hit my eyes. It was enough to transfix me, the warm glow bathing me and everyone around me in a heavenly-like allure. Around me, I could sense them, kids dressed in black on their knees. Next to me, Hot Stuff and Ponytail knelt, blank, head stepped back, unseeing eyes glued to something. When I lifted my own head, I found myself staring at gold. No, not just gold. A mountain of gold. Silver, cash and riches, watches and anything of worth. Anything tinted with diamonds underneath a single swing corpse pinned to the wall. It was a girl, or it had been a girl. Her face wasn't much of a face, flesh peeling from her bones, lips stretched into a wide skeletal grin. Abigail. Something inside my mind snapped. I had been drowning in fog for the last several hours, stuck inside a school I didn't know, with strangers bearing faces I did. When my gaze found Abigail, however, I knew exactly where I was, and I knew who she was. I knew who I was. The deep crevices where her eyes had been burned into me, as my purged mind was given clarity. I saw a flash of bulimia grasping hold of a flailing girl with wide, terrified eyes and forcing food into her mouth, his lips cruelly twisted into a look of mania. When she did force down the food, he crammed another cupcake in her mouth, squeezing her nose so she was forced to swallow it down, her eyes filling with tears. Another flash, and this time I was seeing a classroom. Hot Stuff wielding a knife glowing orange and pressing it to the girl's flesh, making her scream and cry out, trying to get away. But he just shoved her down, pressing harder until the burning blade was melting her skin. Barbie joined them, clawing at the girl's hair, a maniacal grin twisting her lips, drawing all over her face with eyeliner. "We're going to make you look so cute, Abby, like a doll." Finally, my last memory, a startling agony starting to build in my chest. Abigail sat on the edge of the well outside of the school grounds. Hot Stuff and bulimia held her down. Barbie stood several feet away filming everything, with Josie next to her, giggling. This time, it was my voice that sounded out. "Do witches float? Let's see. Abby, sweetie, if you sink, you're a witch. But if you're innocent, you'll float. How does that sound, huh? Sound fun?" Before she could open her mouth, I was thrusting my arms forward and shoving her into the dark, my own lips curved into a grin. "Sink," I said with a laugh. "Sink," Hot Stuff hollered, with the others joining in. Abigail reached out for me, grasping hold of the collar of my shirt, and something changed in her eyes, a glitter that made me stumble back. "Get off of me!" I shrieked, shoving her forwards. "F***ing witch!" Coming out of the memory, I knew exactly who these people surrounding me were, and I knew the power which had taken over them. Hot Stuff was Roman, a Korean diplomat's son. Bulimia, Cal, whose mother owned a well-known fast food chain. Barbie, Marie. The mere presence of her family sent shockwaves through anyone brave enough to get to know her. But there was one person missing. I saw glimpses of him in the memory. When I had shoved the girl, I freaked out, trying to get one of them to help me, but they just laughed. Jared, my boyfriend, wrapped his arms around me and swung me around, the two of us laughing, entangled in a kiss. Just pretend it didn't happen, he murmured into my ear, before shouting at the others.
Understand, it was suicide.
He pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it up, taking a drag.
The girl was never going to fit in here anyway.
Jared. Blinking rapidly, I searched for him. Roman had quickly gotten to his feet after being handed something sitting on a velvet cushion, before dropping to his knees in front of Abigail's corpse. He started to chant in a low murmur, the others surrounding him joining in, their minds and bodies taken over. When I crept towards him, trying to squint in the candlelight, I realized it was a head. Jared's head. I could still see hair sprouting from a decomposing skull, which I had already seen snapped off of his body by Cass, and Marie thrusting a gilded knife through his skull. I remember screaming and being dragged back, a knife pressed to my throat, and a promise by Abigail, spoken through Marie's lips, which trailed across my neck in a kiss. At the corner of my eye, hundreds of threaded dolls with my classmates' faces stood against the wall. 4 of them were torn limb from limb, blood like string pouring from their heads. She would take a piece of me, like I had taken a piece of her. That promise was held, as once the chanting had stopped, I was forced onto a bed of stone, the cruel, cold blade of a scalpel slicing into my flesh, my screams gagged by a hand that scalded my lips, sending my thoughts into a dizzying spiral of nothing. But I didn't fall asleep. Abigail didn't let me. Instead, I was forced to watch them delve into the meat of me, slowly, so I would feel everything and take a chunk of me away. I saw it in their hands, smeared in slithering red and glistening gore. When I woke up screaming, back inside my dorm room, I thought it was a nightmare, until my gaze found bloody sheets, and under my shirt, clumsy stitches barely holding my stomach together. When I blinked, there she was in the corner of my eye, smiling that same skeletal grin. I tried to get out again, but I am stuck with her. I am stuck here with Abigail implanted inside of me. She is everywhere, and I can't escape. I know I'm a bad person. I did something awful, and she is making me pay for it, rightfully so. However, isn't this going too far? How is it even possible to take control of the school like this? How can this girl have so much power over everyone? And most importantly, why hasn't she killed me? I don't even know how I can get an internet connection. I knew she was weird, but this is way beyond anything I have even heard of. Witchcraft. But this isn't the type we caught Abigail doing. It's different. Darker. I'm a disgusting human being. But if you have anything, literally anything, I am begging you, help us.